Okay, great. All right, good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you to the WIRES Summer 2023 meeting. We have a fantastic program. I want to get started so we can kind of keep everything on track. And starting off, I want to introduce the WIRES president for this year, Stacy Burberry, so she can provide a welcome for everybody to today's session. So, Stacy.
Thanks, Larry. Just want to start off and welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. As Larry noted, we have some distinguished panelists and some really exciting topics to talk about. And, it's exciting given today's FERC open meeting and the fact that we're on the brink of so many important changes in our industry, and leaning forward into this discussion around transmission planning and how to protect assets and ensure the safety and integrity of our electric reliability system is something that I know that we are all deeply invested in. So really look forward to today's discussion, and thank you again for joining us all.
Great, thank you, Stacy. So as Stacy mentioned, we have some fantastic speakers on our panel, but we've got a terrific keynote speaker to kick everything off for us today, and it's my pleasure to introduce John Baer, who is the CEO of Mid-Continent ISO. John's been at MISO since 2004, so he's pretty much seen it all, I would guess, over the course of that time period. We all know how important RTOs and ISOs are to getting the infrastructure we need, particularly transmission infrastructure we need, built and put into place. And frankly, MISO has been one of the more successful, if not most successful, RTOs in terms of getting regional transmissions infrastructure planned and built. Whether you look at their MVP program or now the upcoming LRTP. So, John, thank you very much for being with us today. We're all anxious to hear what your thoughts are. John's going to speak for part of the session on the keynote address, and then he's willing to take some questions from us. So start thinking about what you'd like to ask him about. And, John, we appreciate your being here with us today.
Thanks, Larry. And on the Q&A piece, I'm happy to take suggestions too. You guys probably have some good ideas that we should incorporate into what we're doing. As I talked with Kurt and Derek and some others about sort of what to talk about today, I thought it's important to sort of back us up a little bit before we dive into the transmission piece of it and put context around sort of what's going on. I, like a lot of you, have been in this industry for a long time, and I've never seen sort of a situation, if you will, a confluence of events, whatever you want to call it, like we have today. It is really amazing. If I go back and think about, where we were when we did the multi-value projects in the early 2010s, we had a situation where we had a lot of renewable energy goals from different states, and they wanted to put a lot of wind on our system. We had a system that was really designed for a lot of small utilities. It wasn't designed for a regional transmission organization. And so we were running a regional market with a sub-regional transmission system. And so what we did was worked with our states who had sort of common interest was let's get the very inexpensive renewable energy on the system and let's figure out a way to do that together and share the cost. And so we were able to do that, right? We put what was then thought to be a gigantic portfolio of $6 billion in place. It was regional in nature and really made MISO a regional market, right? It allowed us to do that. And so we did that. We did a very, I would argue, conservative benefit to cost ratio, which gave us approximately 3.5 to 4 to 1 benefit to cost ratio, which I don't know about your 401k, but mine's not quite that good. And it turned out really well, and everybody was happy once that was over. And I think the only regret I have about doing that is it was not big enough, right? We sort of sized it down. But part of the challenge as we move forward now is we've got targets on sort of decarbonization that are very aggressive all across our region. They're different in different states, which provides us some value to sort of how to weave those together. But they are really aggressive. And we stepped back 3 years ago and spent a lot of time with our members to see what those targets look like. And we put together some futures, and you'll be a little humor in there is that I think we spent as much time arguing what to name the futures as we did how to develop what was in them. And it's amazing how people will react to semantic warfare as you get into those discussions. So we very creatively named them Future 1, Future 2, and Future 3. So we pushed forward with that, and then we wrapped them into a program that we call the Reliability Imperative, because there are some real reliability issues that I know all of you are aware of that are affecting us in our industry more than ever, and they're really in play today, and that is that we forever have treated capacity like a commodity, because it largely was, right? You had fuel-powered plants. They provided attributes to the system. As long as we had enough of that on the hottest day in the summer, we had enough for the rest of the year, and it wasn't a problem, right? And some significant changes have happened that have made all of that untrue, right? And created some real questions that we have to answer as we move forward as an industry, right? The first thing is assets are all different, right? So how many assets do we have and what are they worth, right? How do we credit those assets for when they can be available? It's not windy all the time. It's not sunny all the time, right? And I can't get fuel all the time. So when you combine all those things together, it provides us all some accreditation headaches as we go through and see what's there with those assets. The second thing is, I don't think we're completely aware of how much risk we're taking right now, right? We've got a 1 day in 10 standard. It's based, again, on that reserve margin. That's the hottest hour, the hottest day of the year. And it's really not a good measure of what's there. Now, there's some great work being done on estimated unserved energy and things like that. And we're really sort of, bearing down on accrediting these assets so we know how much we have and when we have it. But then you combine that with some significant weather changes, and it's really thrown things up in the air. And what I mean by that is we've got some significant challenges on the system today, in case anybody's been asleep, right? I was on a bunch of operations calls this morning, but it's the summertime. All the transmission's on, all the generation's on, right? So we're hoping for a few storms to dampen things up, and we need to make sure it's windy. But it's just much different talking about a summer day than it is talking about a winter day. And the last 5 times we've had significant stress on our systems, it's been in the winter, right? That used to never happen. And what's changed? What's different? Well, we're getting extreme weather, right? It's getting really cold. So you've got a lot of heat that goes on. And in the mid-continent part of the country, that means that home heating is high and natural gas is being used there, right? And so second, you start to say, well, okay, that's great, but I have all these power plants available. What's the problem? Well, they can't get gas, right? Because they're fighting for gas. And that is a big challenge, right? And when you have the correlation of those events, it creates a lot of challenges and a lot of problems, right? And that's a very deep discussion, which I won't take us down into today, but I think it's important to talk about. So then you say, all right, what else is different? Well, now you've got acceleration of the retirement of these plants, right? You've got gas problems in the winter. So how do we think about that risk, right? And how do we mitigate that risk? And there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. But the most important thing we can do to solve all those problems and help mitigate all those problems as efficiently as possible so we can provide a high level of reliability at a lowest cost is to build transmission. Now, how do you go about that? It sounds easy, right? But anybody who has been involved, and I know that Kim would appreciate this, in that transmission process, it's not easy, right? It's really not easy. So we stepped back and looked at what helped us to become successful with our multi-value projects, and how can we take the lessons learned from that and move that forward, right, and capture it. And I'll give you a couple steps that we went through, which I think were pretty important as we did it, and how things worked out, and then how we're moving forward. We've put $60 billion of transmission, we've approved $60 billion of transmission since 2003. So we've been hard at work, right? But our planning processes, and most of the RTO planning processes are incremental, right? You do reliability projects within those annual planning processes, and you do interconnection studies, and you have people that interconnect. And those are largely incremental. And it's a really inefficient way to build out your transmission system, but it's challenging to get people to look far enough ahead so that we can build the transmission system we need and then grow into it versus build the transmission system one step at a time, which is how we've done it largely, right? So if you think about what we're up against, you got these significant portfolio changes, you've got significant weather changes and differences. We have a huge queue backlog. There's almost 300 gigawatts of capacity, nameplate capacity in our interconnection queues, and we have 125 gigawatt peak load. So some context for you, that's a lot, right? And a lot of change out. We've got resource shortages that are coming up. We're 1.5 gigawatts above our reserve margin this summer. Next summer, we'll be below that, right? Absent some contracting done with our friends at PJM who are a little bit long. So we're kind of right on the edge there. And the attributes that we need inevitably to maintain this are going away. And so how do we balance all that out and how do we bring it together? So we brought our stakeholders together. we put together our future studies, and Future 1 was what everyone had announced with a little bit of a discount. Future 2 was a little more aggressive approach on what people had announced. And Future 3 had a lot of electrification built into it, right, which we're seeing a lot of too, particularly in the transportation sector. And so we started down the path with our first tranche. Now, the other thing we did was divided it up into tranches, which I think was really important for us to do versus try to do it all at one time, because from a planning process, that would have taken too long. So we started down the path, and we got into some big discussions about, the central and the northern part of MISO's transmission system are significantly different than the south region part of MISO's transmission system. They were just designed completely different. And so we had to work a lot with our members to help them understand that, because a lot of people were looking from their own lens as opposed to looking outside in. And so what we found is our northern and central part of MISO are largely very significantly intertied, overlapping systems, right? Alternating current, tremendous transfer capability. And that's important because we could move benefits around if we could enhance that transfer capability. As we got to the southern part of our footprint, what we found is we're constrained, largely 3,000 megawatts of constraint between the two, which is full today, by the way, going south to north. And we had more load pocket type designs, right? And so even if you could take all this wind and solar that we were going to install in the northern and central part of MISO and get it down to the border, you couldn't get it all into the south. And once you got it there, you couldn't move it all around, right? So we sort of stepped back from that and said, okay, we got to think about this, because if we can't move the benefits around, we can't move the costs around, right? It's pretty simple. So in our partnership with OMS, which is the most valuable thing I think MISO has today, we did a lot of discussion, a lot of work. And what we came up with was, let's bifurcate our footprint, right? And so let's do tranche 1 in the north and central, right? That's where most of the aggressive decarbonization targets are. Let's figure out how to build out the south, right, separately, and keep those costs and benefits separate. And then let's figure out how to come back to the north and do a second tranche because of the aggressive targets. And then we'll try to bring those two together, right? So that's sort of the plan we went down. So tranche 1 we came out with at the beginning of this year. It's a little over $10 billion in the north and the central. Under pretty conservative estimations, I think the benefit to cost ratios are 3 to 1 or better. And again, I think those are going to show to be much larger as we move forward. And we're now moving forward with the second tranche, which is maybe $20 billion additional. So that'll give us $30 billion just in MISO central and north to make sure that we can bring on the decarbonization assets that they need and do it in a really efficient manner. Because it's really, if you look at the system and you go back to the benefits that we calculated in the multi-value projects, it was largely congestion costs, right? And gas prices were a lot higher. And so congestion costs were easy to quantify, and they were easy to get, to be honest. It was kind of the low-hanging fruit that we talk about. So fast forward to what we're trying to do today, and you've got a tremendous amount of wind. We have 25 gigawatts of wind in MISO. So if you look at that, that's driven prices down. So congestion prices, while congestion's still there, the pricing of it is not quite what it was, right? And natural gas prices have dropped. So trying to understand where those benefits are and how to get them is really important. And then making sure that you can demonstrate that everybody who's having to pay is getting a significant amount of benefits is really important. And we were able to do that. So the first tranche went through. The second tranche, I think, is going to be ready to go first part of next year. So we should maybe April, May of next year, we'll have that approval from our board of directors moving forward. And we've made significant progress in the south on how we're going to allocate those costs. And we're now moving forward to what system are we going to plan down there, right? What are you going to see? And I think we've got roughly $3.5 to $4 billion of transmission investment in the south inside of our planning queue right now. And so it's moving forward and I think in a good way. If you think about the design trade-offs that you go through, it's not going to be an optimal design necessarily because you've got timing and you've got things like siting and permitting, right, that you have to work with. One of the things that our designers did, which I think was brilliant in our first tranche, was they used existing right-of-way as much as possible. I think 90% of the transmission we built in the first tranche was in existing right-of-way. Now, the competitive developers screamed at us and claimed that we were discriminating against them, and that was not the case. What we were trying to do is make sure we could use the existing right-of-way as best possible. One of our remaining elements of the MVP projects from 2011 that I referenced earlier is still not complete because of a siting debate. I don't know what you'd call it, disagreement that's going on in Wisconsin. So we're trying to expedite that. So the Tranche 1 was done that way. Tranche 2 will not be that way because you can't use all that right away up. And it does create complications because you have to take the transmission out of service to put the new transmission in and enhance the sort of flow on those lines. But Tranche 2 will be a little bit different in that aspect as we look forward to it. But as we go forward and think about, how do we do Tranche 3, and then, what do we look at as we bring the two regions together, those things will continue to be on our mind. And then the other thing we got to think about now, which I'm very concerned about, is supply chain issues. It's real, right? We've got about 50 gigawatts in MISO that has cleared our interconnection queue, that has signed interconnection agreements, and they're asking for 3-year delays. And as we surveyed them and talked to them, roughly 60% of the reasons, that 60% of them have supply chain reasons is why. They have trouble with labor, they're having trouble with materials, right, to interconnect to the system. So my guess is that's going to also translate into the transmission build out that we're going to see. And we're a little bit ahead, but I think others are moving pretty quickly to build transmission. So once that happens, this won't get any better. So we're going to have to work through that and think about what all the implications of that are. So that kind of covers the regional piece. The other thing that I want to mention here that I think is really important is the inter-regional piece to this. We spent a lot of time with our friends at PJM maybe 4 or 5 years ago and put together a portfolio of projects. And we didn't spend a ton of money on it. I think we roughly spent maybe $25 million, but we got an excess of a 10-to-1 cost-benefit ratio or benefit-cost ratio. And that's pretty important. And I will tell you guys, as we move forward and look at our risk profile in MISO, it used to be if you could cover your largest generator being out or your largest element of transmission being out, you were probably okay. And now what it is our biggest risk is a 5 to 6 day wind deficit, right? If you go back and look at Elliott, it was not windy, Uri, it was not windy in MISO. Very still, right, which is rare for a winter, but it was. We brought 14,000 megawatts across that seam from PJM. Gave some to SPP and consumed a lot of it. But that was the difference between us having the lights on and lights off for a lot of people. Fast forward to Uri, and it was really windy in MISO, right? We sent maybe 8,000 megawatts or so to PJM, and they had some gas fuel curtailment issues. But the seam is really valuable, is my point, right? And the diversity that goes across that seam. And so enhancing that is really important. And we've got some work underway to do that now. But those kind of things are important. We tried something new, learning from what we did with PJM, with SPP recently, and that's moving forward. We call it our Joint Transmission Interconnection Queue work. I have a fine that I put on our employees if they use an acronym, and I double the fine if they don't know what the acronym is. So I got to make sure that I don't use one here. But it's a really, I think, innovative way to think about this. We've got a lot of resources that are in the interconnection queue that sit on that seam. And what's happening is we do these interconnection studies is we have to look at adjacent systems to understand what the impact is, right? So inevitably we're bumping into each other. We're either causing a problem on an SPP system or they're causing a problem on ours as we try to move folks through the queue. And I try to describe the queue process we have today, which the interconnection process says it's sort of like watching the penguins. They all kind of walk over to the ledge and look, and it's really steep, and so then they walk back. But eventually one of them maybe will jump, right? And then a bunch of them will jump in. But you've got an E in a curve in that you've got so much cost that's going to be borne by the next person in the interconnection queue that no one can do it, right? And so we worked with their folks to come up with about a $2 billion portfolio of transmission projects that can be shared by the folks in those interconnection queues. And I think it'll get roughly 40 gigawatts through that queue, which is pretty powerful if you think about it, and get that moved forward. We've also gone to the DOE and applied for funding to get about half of that paid for, through that program that they had out there. So I think it's a very innovative way to do that, and it makes what is the most fun discussion in transmission planning, cost allocation, much easier because we pushed it back into the interconnection queue. So you kind of have an audience of, okay, who wants to sign up for this? We can lower your cost. Otherwise, you've got an alternative that's pretty darn high. And so I think it's a pretty efficient way to move things forward. And we'll take those concepts and start to work with PJM soon on trying to get some of those things accomplished as we can move those forward. And hopefully there'll still be some DOE money around to help subsidize that. But to the extent we can bolster those, clear our interconnection queues and get through it, I think that's pretty important. So sort of to close up, don't forget that we're all inextricably linked. Those seams are really important. Planning has got to be done long range. You can't do it incrementally, right? We're going too fast. The resource goals and the decarbonization goals that we're looking at just in MISO are significantly higher with our Future 2A that we just revised versus Future 2, right? And they are pushing us to levels of system operations that we hadn't envisioned for another 5 to 7 years. So all the things that we're trying to do in our reliability imperative to address those things are there. And I think it's also sort of emphasizing the need to get this transmission moving and get it built, right? We can do a lot of things, and we have to do them through a stakeholder process, which is fine, but none of them takes as long as building transmission, right? So getting sort of what I'll call the long pole in the tent moving, because 8 to 10 years is kind of light speed to get that stuff done, is important, right? And that assumes that we can get permitting and siting done, and the supply chain will be there when we need it, right? But that stuff's got to get moved. But you can't do it incrementally. You've got to step way forward and look at the resource mix that you think is coming, and we got to accommodate it, right? And do it on a regional basis so that we can move it around, because it's become so clear to us, right? When it's not windy and sunny in certain places, you have to move, sort of long duration, controllable resources. And when it is wind and sunny, you need to be able to move it around, right? The biggest issue we want to avoid is one that we've seen in parts of Europe and even in California, where they're curtailing a lot of those resources, and the investment that the customers are making in them is not very efficient, right? If they're curtailing them all the time, we got to be able to move that around. So I guess final thing is even with all that, Grid Strategies gave us a B, which I'm still unhappy about. So we're going to try to figure out how to get ourselves up to an A. And with that, I'll pause and take any questions, discussion, or suggestions that you guys might have.
Well, thank you, John. Really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and hearing about how things are happening within MISO. I'm going to go ahead and exercise executive director privilege and start off with the first question so folks can kind of think about what else they'd like to ask about. I'm sure there won't be any shortage of questions for you, but I'll start with one which involves an issue that we're seeing increasingly being raised recently, particularly at FERC, but also up in Congress, which is the use of advanced technologies and grid-enhancing technologies within the development of the grid and the system. I guess I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about to what extent is that a factor in how MISO views the development of its system, or is that something that's really more at the utility level? If you could just talk a little bit about how that plays into your processes at MISO.
Sure. So there's kind of two elements to sort of improving the throughput, if you will, on the transmission system, right? So there's some incremental things that we can do, maybe even marginal things like ambient line ratings, things like that we're all working on, because we want to make sure if we're moving forward with a big dollar amount of transmission to get built, that we've optimized and used as best we could what we had, right, first. We don't want to leave latent capacity there. So there's a lot of things around that. The grid enhancing technologies that are employed today at a commercial level and scale, I think fall more into that category. They're not fundamental in most cases, right? They're allowing us to get a little bit more out of that transmission system, and we are looking at that. And so the answer to your question is yes, all of the above. But even with those things, what we're finding is we have got to build more transmission, right? It's because the portfolio of resources that we're using is fundamentally different, right, than it was in the past. And so that change is definitely needed. And it's some of those technologies that people will talk about are viable and good. Some of them are still a ways off, right? It's a little bit like the discussion we have on resource adequacy, where people say, well, you need to use a battery. I say, well, that's great. We got a lot of batteries on the system, but a battery's good for 4 hours. What do I do when we don't have energy for 5 days, right? It's more matching those things up with your risk and making sure that we have the transmission system that we need to push those things forward.
Great. We already got one up. Let me move over here.
Thank you. David Strobridge with ITC. It's great to see you here. So what we've been doing in MISO, it's all been, on a voluntary basis, right? So from your perspective, what is the top thing you'd like to see from FERC in any capacity that would help you guys out as a region and us as a region to push forward?
Do you mean just overall, or are you talking about from a transmission perspective?
Well, transmission perspective, since we're here, but anything, that you would like to see from a policy perspective from FERC that would help us as a region, meet our needs?
I think that from a MISO perspective, I feel like we have what we need from FERC. I mean, I think that we are blessed with a largely vertically integrated system, right, which helps. We have a great partnership with OMS, our state regulators, who want to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. And to the extent that we can continue to show them the benefit to cost ratios that we've been able to demonstrate and work together in a transparent way with our members to demonstrate that, I think we have what we need, right? So, the things that worry us are more supply chain and siting and permitting. So if siting and permitting could get streamlined, that would be the place I would probably point.
Chris Kazowitz from Power Engineers. Thank you for being here. So I do a lot of work in the CAISO, and one of the things that we've been focusing on out there is the impacts of climate change over 20, 30, 50, 80-year time horizons. Is MISO looking at that as well? And if not, how are you guys incorporating the impacts of climate change over a long period of time?
So we're not exactly, models are models, right, in terms of those climate change. What we're doing is looking at what the impacts of climate change are versus climate change itself, right? So what we're seeing is a 100-year storm every 3 years, right, which maybe it's not a 100-year storm then. So how do we work on that? And it goes back to the risk that I talked to you about earlier. So when we start looking at our system 15 years from now and saying, all right, let's look at new resources around the system, different weather events are happening, how do we handle those? Can we handle those, right? Which gets us into the discussion about the attributes that our resources can provide and the transmission system we need to optimize that. And so we're trying to think about it that way and bringing those things together.
Stacy has one.
Thanks, Drew. Stacy Berberet with AEP. John, you spoke to the benefits of interregional transmission, and we know that very little has actually been built under Order 1000. So 2 questions. Why? And how do we fix it going forward? Do you support, from a MISO perspective, some type of forcing mechanism like a minimum transfer requirement?
So forcing mechanisms when you lead voluntary membership organizations are challenging. But I think the reason you haven't seen a lot of inter-regional transmission is we've all been a little bit long with our reserve margins, and so you haven't seen the value of it, right? What we're finding now as we get right on this razor's edge of our reserve margin is it's incredibly valuable, right? I think that the folks in Texas would tell you they could have had a lot of benefit if they'd been interconnected to the broader system, right, when things happened. The reason it's not getting built is that and the fact that cost allocation, even when you're in your own region, is hard. It really is. We will approve projects of $10, $20, $30 million, but we will fight to the death over that last $1,000 if it isn't allocated in the right place. And so it's just one of those realities. If you want to have a good time in the RTO, start talking about cost allocation. Within a region, it's easier because we can demonstrate those benefits around. If you're working at a seam, the folks on the other side of the seam inherently don't believe that they're getting the benefits that the people that sit on the seam are getting. And that's where it kind of breaks down. But I think, again, I'm very hopeful as we go forward that without a mandate, we're going to be able to get some of those things done because people are starting to see the value as these portfolios change and the weather changes, that we can operate at those really efficient levels of risk, if you will. In other words, the lowest possible investment to get the most risk aversion. And those seams are incredibly important to transfer around.
I had you just stand there.
We found the biggest guy we could to pass the mic around.
That's right. That's right.
Thankfully, I got a long wingspan.
Hang out there. John, thanks very much. It was great introductory comments. I'm Dave Weaver from Exelon, and I was intrigued by your comment for the first tranche and leveraging the existing right-of-way. And, I was just curious how you make that I think that's kind of a low-hanging fruit, right? How do you build out that existing infrastructure to make the most of the capacity available there and not, potentially bottlenecking what's existing? And so I guess the question, part of it is a compliment to be leveraging that and looking at that and saying, what transmission can we truly get built in the near term, most likely. But then do you work with your utilities to think about how to maximize the benefits of those rights of way? I mean, is there can we look at the design implementation of quad structures, or is there a breakdown and rebuild that we can make the most of the existing infrastructure as much as possible? So
the answer to your question is absolutely, right? And that brings in the grid enhancing technologies too, and we try to optimize those things. Now, the question you didn't ask, but let me ask it for you, is if you go too incremental in this, and even we're going out there, but we're still a little bit incremental, we're having some big debates about voltage level, right? Because as you step through it, you might use 345s, right? But if you have to put three 345s in where you could have used one 865 or whatever the higher voltage you used is that going to be faster or easier or more efficient? So we're going through a lot of those debates right now about higher voltage versus lower voltage. The cost, of course, as well as the optimizing, as you said, that space. So those are the bigger debates I think that are in front of us that we're still trying to grapple with. DC, we've looked at a lot. DC is expensive, and it's hard to show benefits to everybody if you're using DC. Alternating current is a lot easier when the benefit calculations come along. Got one in the back too.
Should I go, Larry, should I go front or back? Jody first, okay. Here, hand it down, folks.
Thanks, John. I'm Jody Moskowitz from PSEG. And my question is, there's a lot of focus now, we're in PJM, focus in PJM, focus at FERC about the distinction between regional and local projects and whether there's sufficient oversight of local projects, and obviously FERC has thrown out the idea of an independent transmission monitor. Just curious about your views on that topic and whether MISO has the same level of discussion about regional versus local, and whether local projects are supplanting regional transmission projects. Just your thoughts.
So yes, we do have a lot of discussion about that, and we've sort of stepped back from that years ago and tried to make sure that we had the forums where people could see from a transparency standpoint what was being thought about at a local level and how things were being moved forward on that, so that it was available to everyone. What we're finding is it's not that we don't have enough transparency, but people don't have enough staff to keep up with all that stuff. And so that's a challenge. So we're trying to think about, sort of how do we address that, versus, because personally, I don't think we need a transmission monitor to come in and look over all those things. But we're trying to address that transparency issue head on and make sure we can get everybody comfortable with that versus moving to the larger landscape, because I think we're doing pretty well otherwise.
Hi, John, and thank you for being here. I'm Pamela Quinlan from the new GQ, New Energy Strategies. I wanted to dig in a little bit on your comment about interregional transmission and how in the past, maybe part of the reason it hasn't been built is because of the reserve margins, which, obviously many regions are concerned about how those are shrinking or may shrink. One of the questions I have is the timing of that as an actual solution and the buy-in on the other regions. So if the idea would be that the value proposition of interregional transmission is going to become more apparent because we're going to have smaller reserve margins, but the time frame by which those projects that they'd have to be studied and built to solve it would still be a pretty long range for it. It would seem to me like you'd have to get pretty ahead of that challenge to use interregional transmission as a way to really help solve it. And that would require some buy-in, not just from like you on the idea, but also your counterparts in the regions and some general shared understanding of how to think about that. And I guess my question to you is, are those, from your standpoint, are those conversations really happening with respect to the looming concerns related to tightening reserve margins? And do you all have the information you need to think about how interregional transmission can help with it?
So two answers to your question. I do think it's going to become more and more important, right? And as you noted, the most important thing there is both sides need to be motivated to do that. And so I think everybody is sufficiently concerned with the weather patterns, the changing in the resource portfolio mixes, that it's going to be important to have it. But I would divide it up into sort of two tranches. One is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit because we haven't done a lot at those seams that we can work on that I think is, I mean, Ken and I talked this morning, and I know he's working with our guys on this stuff, but there's a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit things that don't involve stringing a bunch of new lines that can be done, right, which will help. But to your point, if we are going to have to do more lines, it is going to take some time to study it, and then you got the permitting siding and the supply chain and all those kinds of things. So 8 to 10 years at that light speed rate to get that stuff done, maybe. So that is a concern on the next piece of it. But I do think it's going to be really important. And I think as we evolve over the next 3 years, I think everyone is going to be real motivated to tie together with their neighbors.
So John, I'll take over again, and in looking at your really impressive resume, I noticed one of the things you have on there also is that you're also head of the very large power grid operators group. I'm not sure if I quite got that right. GO15 or GO15.
We changed it to save ourselves, yes, to the
So
GO15.
I guess I was curious, given your perspective of heading up that group and working with so many other power grid operators, could you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like and how that may play into or inform some of the issues we're talking about on transmission?
So there's some really, so there's a group that came together in 2003, I think, after the large system disturbance in North America, to try to work on issues, common issues, and share knowledge. And that was called the Very Large Power Grid Operators, which is a sassy name, isn't it? So we changed it to the GO15, but it is the largest power market and grid operators across the planet, right? So think Russian grid, Chinese grid, Japanese grid, Korean grid, Europeans, Brazilians. I mean, we get together a couple times a year and oversee it. And we've got a lot of working groups that are going on that are studying things, right? Things like renewable penetration, right? At certain levels of renewable penetration and inverter-based technologies, what happens to the system and how it operates, and what do you need to mitigate that? So there's just a tremendous amount of lessons learned because we're all facing very similar situations. It also gives us great anecdotes to work with policymakers, right? So the story of what happened in Germany, right, is pretty interesting, where they became completely dependent upon Russian gas, turned all the coal plants and nuclear plants off, and brought on all the renewables, and then all of a sudden the gas went away, right? So those kind of things and now they got their coal plants back on, and they're probably emitting more carbon today than they were before. So how you do this and making sure you have a sort of well-sequenced transition plan is critical, right? And we don't. That's a real challenge here. The other interesting thing that comes out of that is if you look at what's happening in certain parts of the world, say Russia, India, and China, they're still putting a tremendous amount of new coal plants on their systems, right? So while we're fighting to reduce carbon, those guys are trying to make sure they've got low-cost, reliable energy. And so there are some interesting lessons learned that come out of that. But I think that the sort of knowledge sharing that we're getting about how to operate these systems going forward is really valuable and really important.
I'm going to follow up with another one, and I want to go back to one of the issues you flagged in your opening comments, which is some of the concerns you have over supply chain issues. That is an area that I'm increasingly hearing concerns raised by WIRES members more frequently. I guess I'm curious, to what extent do you think those are going to wind up having cascading implications for some of the broader policy objectives that we're seeing at the federal and state level? Do you have any thoughts in terms of how folks are going to be able to address some of the concerns on that, if it's going to be pushing things back 2, 3, 5 years, perhaps, on getting infrastructure developed or interconnections being accommodated? And are there discussions that you're aware of, at least at the regulatory or at the legislative level, to raise these concerns or try to come up with solutions to address them?
So I would say that these are, at a federal level, nascent concerns. In other words, they're sort of just starting to show themselves in a lot of places. We're seeing, so I'm not is plugged into some of the bigger discussions that they're having about these items. I know at state levels, there's a lot of activity going on. There's a few states inside of our footprint that are doing things like, putting together, and the munis and co-ops have been doing this for a long time, right? But the IOUs are now coming together and saying, let's buy some transformers, right? Let's get some equipment. Let's think about what we might need as a group, buy it, put it in place, and then as we need it, we'll pull it out of that inventory and install it to try to keep these timelines down. But this is going to make things go slower, which is going to make everybody unhappy. And the concern I have is as you delay things, whether it's transmission infrastructure or the resources, and we continue to retire assets, it's not going to help reliability. And that's probably our biggest concern.
Any other questions from anybody? Yep. Okay, good. Here we go. This isn't usually a shy group, so.
So you mentioned about talking about supply chain and mentioning how interconnection customers were able to use that 3-year delay period. I know that there have been some comments about getting rid of that 3-year delay period. And by the way, I'm Kim Duffley, North Carolina Utilities Commission. And within North Carolina, we had queue squatters. So when we were trying to clear the queue, we did not like that 3-year kind of queue squat when we had first come, first served policies. So what are your views about this 3-year kind of delay, and should we get rid of that?
I think we ought to, I don't know if we need to get rid of it, but I think 3 years is too long, right? Because all the things that happen in the queue that cause the churn make the queue slow down because you're continually having to study, right, what it's going to look like, and you don't know for sure. Okay, we studied it. We've got these folks have signed interconnection agreements. Are they going to build that stuff or not, right? Or have the economics moved so much as interest rates have moved and prices are going up and supply chain constraints? Are they just going to walk away, right? And we've also got declarations and activity going on, which is driving people to get in the queue, and regulatory processes aren't keeping up, right? So utilities are waiting for selection, or they're waiting for a approval by a commission to build, right? Or you've got states that have big goals, but they're behind on their offtake agreements, right? Those kind of things. So we've got to figure out how to piece all that together. We're working on a queue reform filing for the end of this year, and I think we are going to have some stuff in there around how long that queue delay is.
John, quick question. Josh Raleigh with MYR Group. You mentioned Tranche 2. Is that more in the south region than is my understanding? And if so, you said Tranche 1 was maximizing existing right-of-way, which you and David were talking about. Is Tranche 2 more new rights-of-way? I guess give a little more background on what to expect
Sure.
within
So Tranche
that.
1 was north and central, right? Tranche 2 is also north and central. It just be $30 billion of transmission when we're done with those two, and it was just too much to do all at one time, right? So those will largely help with the north and the central. Tranche 3 is the south, right? And there was two things we needed to do there. One, we needed a cost allocation scheme that they were willing to use, which I think we're very close on, and then we needed sort of a set of projects and be able to demonstrate that benefit, which we're in the process of doing now, and then. If everything goes according to plan, Tranche 4 then is to look at, okay, how do we better intertie the north and the south? Where are the inflection points on how to do that? And I think you had a second question, which was about the right-of-ways. So we've sort of played that card, right, if you will. And I don't know that there's a whole lot more we can do within the existing right-of-ways, given what we've done already. And so the new projects are largely going to be more greenfield type things. And then the debate really is going to be, well, do you want 3 of them or do you want 1? In other words, what voltage is optimal for us to use in terms of cost and benefit, and also siting and permitting?
Zach Hale with S&P Global. Another question on interregional transmission for you. I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the challenges in modeling lines that are proposed outside of the traditional MISO planning process. It seems like there have been a number of significant lines recently that were proposed under a merchant developer model, and my understanding is that these larger HVDC lines, those require generator interconnection agreements or to go through the interconnection process in MISO, and just what kind of challenges are you kind of experiencing there?
So I would argue they're more political than otherwise, and let me explain what I mean by that. It takes about 18 months of a lot of work to put these plans together, right? Our MTEP plans and our sort of long-term transmission plans. If we have to do scenarios and or include everything that someone is thinking about, we're never going to get finished, right? And even worse than that, you're going to have a suboptimal output, because if you think about a line, a DC line particularly, that's significantly large, and then they don't show up, what have you done, right? And if we do it once, we'll have to do it for everybody. That's the other thing you got to remember when you're in an RTO and you run a big rule set, right? If you do it for one person, everybody's going to want theirs modeled in there too. And I just don't want our long-range transmission planning process to look like the interconnection queue, right? Which is what that would do. So we have rules, we have rule sets, and I think what we have is appropriate, and people need to abide by those.
Larry with the backup questions.
We are getting pretty close to the top of the hour, and think we'll probably wind up wrapping up fairly soon, but this is one of those kind of general conference type questions I want to tee up for you, which is, I know during my time at FERC, different times we'd have folks like you come in and meet with us, talk about what's going on in their region, and you all leave, and I keep thinking, man, I don't know how that person sleeps at night. And I guess my question for you is, what is the thing that keeps you up at night? What's the thing that's the most pressing on your mind in terms of concerns about your role and what's going on within the grid?
Well, there's two things, right? First is cybersecurity, because that is always a big risk, and something we don't talk about a lot publicly. The amount of threats, the amount of attempts to get into our system by bad actors, it has gone up exponentially, like multiple comma exponentially. So that's always a worry, right? Especially with our systems. We are in the process of changing our systems out to become a lot more safe. Our systems were largely built in 2009, and we've strapped a bunch of stuff around them and on them to keep them safe, but it worries me. The biggest worry I have going forward is reliability. And we are moving forward with a set of assets that is not going to provide the attributes that we need. And we are retiring assets that provide those attributes before we have a substitute to put them on. Small modular reactor, hydrogen, long duration storage batteries, whatever it may be, that has a lot of promise. But none of that stuff is commercial today. And so why we're retiring the stuff that works and works well is beyond me, right? Our models can show that while you need that stuff, the gas and the coal that we've depended on, you don't need it very often, right? Maybe it runs 10 to 15% of the time, but that 10 to 15% of the time is the difference between light and dark, and that's pretty important, right? But getting recognition of that is challenging. Things are shifting a bit, and I think folks like Jim Robb and Manu Asthana and others have gotten out there to in front of Congress and other places, and myself and other places like this to make those comments. But we haven't seen action yet, right? We continue with pressure. These new 111D rules from EPA are not going to help that situation. And so while we continue to shut off the things that provide those valuable reliability attributes we need, the other stuff is getting delayed. We've got supply chain problems. And it just really worries me about reliability of the system, which is something we've kind of taken for granted because it's been pretty good.
Just to follow up to that point, John, as part of that shift in retirement, do you believe those assets, those coal units, et cetera, that are providing these reliability attributes are being compensated for those attributes? Is that sort of reflected in current market structures, or do you see the need for change there?
I definitely see a need for change there. And one of the things we're working on within our reliability imperative is to, one, identify those attributes, right, from a risk-based perspective, and then think about how do we compensate them best. Part of the challenge as you look through that is the attributes that we need are in such an abundant supply today that even if we pulled them out and looked at them, we wouldn't compensate them. But then once we start to get short, obviously the pricing and the different things that we're going to have to do to compensate them is going to get pretty big. And so we're trying to get it done now to reflect that. But it's a demand supply problem in the middle of the fact that we've treated it like a commodity.
All right, well, thank you, John. Would everyone please join me in thanking John for taking the time to be here today? Very interesting. So I think what we're going to do at this point, we're going to transition to our first panel, which is going to be focused on grid security issues. We'll take probably about a 10-minute break to allow the panelists to get mic'd up. So if everyone wants to stretch their legs and walk around, I don't know if we're trying to get coffee set up, but I don't think it's out there quite yet, but hopefully it should be there pretty soon. So a little bit of a 10-minute break, everybody.